My friend earlier made me laugh when she said, Safa, is this a wedding day? This is not a marriage, come on. This is just an art presentation. She said, you're probably going to need a stadium in your PhD thesis to have all of these people sit down. But you know, it's always a pleasure to have people sharing with us our most precious moments. So you're welcome. Thank you for being here today. I'm really glad. I'm really glad. Are we guys ready? Yeah? Sure? Okay. What if we go straight into the heart of my presentation today so that we don't waste time? All right? Okay? My presentation is actually divided into 4 major parts. First, I start by the contextualization, and then move to the rationale of my argument. That is, the chapters themselves. What is that I wanted to say from those chapters? And then I'll move to my objectives, the choice of my text, and perhaps, as Mr. Khalifa said, the challenges. Right? Okay. My topic is actually contextualized within the rising and implicit interconnectedness between post-colonial self-fashioning as a paradoxical mode of representation and post-colonial life narratives as paradoxical modes of reading. The focus is basically led on the notion of ambivalence, or the idea, or the term which Baba coined, third space, which I made explicit use of in the 3rd chapter of my dissertation. Now, there is a clarification that I need to make before embarking on the analysis itself, which is the fact that I was reluctant to define the concept, which is ambivalence, for 2 basic reasons. The first is that the concept itself is rooted in ambivalence and indeterminacy, and so by defining it, I might perhaps seem to go against the very argumentative threads of my argument. The second is that I wanted to leave some space for the reader to detect on his or her own the open-endedness of the concept. And here we have Edward Soja, one of the leading theoreticians of the concept, himself warning us against any clear-cut identification of the term, when he says that this is by nature a flexible and tentative and provisional term that is itself used in capturing what are themselves shifting paradigms and ideas. So this is one thing. This is a clarification that I needed to make first. And then, within the same context, of course, the history of self-representational, or what at times deliberately referred to as self-misrepresentational narratives, shows that the creation of these sites of overlap is perhaps the most inescapable of fates. Whenever there is an encounter between metropole and colony, there is always a sense in which subjectivity or selfhood emerges as an impossible moment, marked by the open-endedness of the Fanonian question, I quote, in reality, who am I? And the closure of signification within the context of such a question seems to never come to an end. And so by taking profit from this, by profiting from the open-endedness of the concept, I wanted to get as far away as possible from the reading of post-colonial subjectivity in terms of the Manichaean deliriums of East versus West, Self versus Other, text versus theory, and so on and so forth. I preferred rather to creep into a zone of overlap in which subjectivity and self-fashioning emerge as the most mysterious and most enigmatic of all processes. Okay, and this is where my focus on Baba's 3rd space of enunciation comes from. And part of the significance that the encounter between hegemon and subaltern, or metropole and colony, comes from, is that it transforms itself into a Derridian death prophecy, which never ceases to function like a foreshadowing of death. And of course, I'll come to further explanation to what I precisely meant by this. But already at this level, we see that there is a paradoxical state of affairs. On the one hand, we have the need to mitigate the dangers or the risks and stakes of the anxiety of reference inherent to the displaced postcolonial self. And on the other, this very notion of selfhood is immediately challenged by the Barthesian question, I quote, "Do why not know that in the field of the subject there is no referent?" It is becoming both interesting and challenging that we are becoming more and more aware that the current postcolonial condition cannot be recaptured if we do not relocate the poetics and politics of postcolonial identity within these sites of overlap, where subaltern agency emerges, in the words of bell hooks, I quote, as the site of radical possibility. This is actually the same observation that Chantal Mouffe validates when she argues that we can no longer, in fact, accept the fact that we cling to an image of diasporic subjectivity as the ultimate source of intelligibility of its actions. We should rather adapt those approaches and views to be able to capture the character of the postcolonial condition and the complex rapports that impinge on postcolonial subjectivity itself. But you know, there are questions which come to mind when we are writing down our ideas, and questions that at times risk to paralyze us and to undermine the validity of the whole project altogether. One of these questions, and which I found myself asking more than once, says the following. If the death of the subject has become a settled fact of our contemporary history, and if the thin thread between self-invention and self-construction has been obliterated, as so many critics maintain, then why am I taking the trouble to delve into investigations of this type? Wouldn't I, in the words of Eakin, operate like a dog chasing its own tail? But yeah, you know, this is the same paradox that gave birth to my work, to my project. At some level, I wanted to engage myself in a spontaneous and a practical way in the postmodern paradox. Yes, we know well that we bypassed the time when the agential coherence of the subject can be maintained as a settled fact of our history. Yet, there is always a sense in which we still believe in Smith's declaration that, I quote, "None of us lives without reference to an imaginary singularity, which we call ourselves." And when Philippe Lejeune, remember? Philippe Lejeune was especially amazed. When Lejeune was asked the question, and of course, ironically, Lejeune is one of the theoreticians against whom the basic argument shall be moving. And this is perhaps the only area where I happen to agree with Lejeune. When he was asked, why do you still believe in the legitimacy of your observations on the nature of nonfiction writings, his response was that, he said, of course in a very interesting and funny way, he said, yes, I have been fooled. Go and consider me an insane critic if you want. Go and consider me a fool who still believes in the Holy Ghost and who still believes of the first person and who still believes that we can tell the truth. And here I'll quote him verbatim. Lejeune said, but who doesn't believe in it? And after all, why shouldn't I? In the field of the subject, there is no reference. We indeed know all this. We're not so dumb. But once this precaution has been taken, we go on as if we did not know it. In spite of the fact that autobiography is impossible, this in no way prevents it from existing. And see, here already we have a paradox. And the same paradoxical state governs the choice of my text. And here I found myself stepping outside of the conventional criteria scales, which say that in order to approach the text from a particular theoretical frame, this text has to lend itself perfectly well to investigations of this type. Well, I don't think so, and I don't believe that this is the case, at least as far as out of place is concerned. My choice of the text has been governed by the extent to which out of place confirms a particular theoretical stance and challenges it immediately, right? So this is the paradox that governs the choice of my text. And so by locating out of place within a Babian third space of enunciation, it is those very paradoxes, inconsistencies, and even indifference that to study what George May calls les échecs de l'écriture blessure. That is the crisis, right? Okay. My objectives, to come very quickly to my objectives here veer on the whole project of decolonization, both in terms of genre criticism and subaltern subjectivity. Said's constant remapping and demapping of the post-colonial space is appreciated insofar as it takes place in the third space of enunciation that paves the way for what Baba calls a moment of contra-modernity that appropriates the new cultural politics of difference to its needs and terms. This moment also reconceptualizes and problematizes the notion of selfhood outside this objets d'art, in which people have often been placed like marble statues. Okay? And so within this space of contingency and ambivalence, selfhood, post-colonial selfhood in particular, is appreciated as an even, incomplete production of meaning, in the word of Baba. This space of strategic ambivalence can also be read as a shift to an alternative post-coloniality, where post-colonial self-fashioning emerges as a symbolic textuality that is located in the performative present of cultural enunciation. Selfhood is produced at the site of the self as narration, as writing the self, which serves, of course, as a necessary step towards the deconstruction of hegemonic historiography. These are basically some of the objectives that I wanted to reach, and of course I'll elaborate on them by the end of this presentation, okay? Moving on now very quickly to the first chapter entitled The Poetics of Nonfiction and the Autobiographical Path, the Dialectic of Self-Negation and Self-Dislocation. We've just said that the focus is basically led on the, what Georges May calls les échecs de l'écriture blessure, that is the crisis, as a necessary step towards the disclosure of the ambivalence of Said's autobiographical moment. The first section of this chapter covers actually Lejeune's postulations on the nature of nonfiction writing, and the basic question here has been, what is an autobiographical pact for Lejeune? And Lejeune answers the question by starting from the following assumption, that autobiographical discourse is contractual by nature. And so, according to him, an autobiographical pact is a written contract that enters into the ethics of genre itself, and which grants and necessitates, both grants and necessitates an identity between the subject and object of discourse, that is, between author, narrator, and protagonist in Lejeune's terms. And the ordinary function of the pact is usually verified in relation to the proper name, according to Lejeune. And his insistence on situating the whole problematic in a specific relation to the proper name shows the extent that Lejeune shows the importance that Lejeune accords to the proper name as a referential label. Right, and here I'm going to quote Lejeune because this is a quotation which shows the importance of the proper name and the referential stats of the proper name, according to Lejeune, which is responsible for the entire act of the autobiographical performance. He says, I quote, the entire existence of the person we call the author is summed up by his name. The only mark in the text of an unquestionable world beyond the text, referring to a real person. The deep subject, this is one of my friends who, I haven't seen him for 2 years now. And he's one of my dear friends, so you're welcome, Liam. Thank you for coming. Okay, now I'll carry on. The deep subject of autobiography is the proper name, says Lejeune. And within Lejeune's, unquote, of course, within Lejeune's conception of autobiographical discourse, generic identity, as we already know, I mean, because, of course, I'm writing for a specific audience, right? I'll come to that by the end. Anyway, the generic identity, according to Lejeune, is a matter of a firm resolution. Unlike the discourse of nonfiction, or fiction, sorry, unlike the discourse of fiction, it generates other categorical affirmations or categorical negations. Whether we say that this is autobiographical or not. So there is no room for rough calculations or approximations of any sort. And hence, Legend's notorious declaration, autobiography does not involve degrees. It is all or nothing. So the autobiographical path is referential to the extent that it homogenizes, unifies the subject of discourse and the object of discourse, the subject of enunciation and that of utterance in the first person through the following promise. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And this is these are Legend's words, of course. Sorry?
Not in the portal go here.
Yeah, this is it. I'm going to comment about that because, this is an authoritative legal terminology, which, according to Legend, enters into the ethics of genre itself.
Since you're talking in such a nice way together, I suggest that from time to time you look at us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
And you see,
yeah.
from a long distance.
Okay.
And I think
No. You know that I'm very happy that you're here today, but just because I wanted to address the audience.
But they're having the bulk of it.
Yeah. Okay. No, I know that you already have it all. So, okay. So, I relocate an out of place at the heart of the postmodern anxieties and skepticism towards all forms of categorical thinking, Madame Darshuna. I wanted to deliberately challenge so many of Legend's critical insights. Therefore, the second part of the chapter is a close examination of some of the questions that have been leading the postmodern debate on the nature of nonfiction writing, revising along the way so many of Legend's postulations on the nature of nonfiction writing. The focus is, as I said, is that on the crisis, anxieties, and even ambiguities that govern the journey from beginning to end. The first of these crises, which goes as a straight and explicit deconstruction of the status of the proper name, is of course the crisis in nomenclature that enhanced the title of the following section, Born to Die, the proper name and the crisis in nomination or nomenclature. Throughout the text, what Said basically does is that he undermines the referential status of the name and thus turning so many of Legend's claims upside down, especially the claim that, he turns this, how does he turn the referential status of the name upside down? By clinging essentially to the politics of anonymity, what I call the politics of anonymity here. Therefore, turning so many of Legend's claims upside down, particularly the claim that authors of autobiographical discourse are a long way from is coextensive with the crisis in memory. Madame Darshuna is laughing. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm enjoying.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. The other thing, the crisis in nomination is coextensive with that in memory, which destabilizes even further the referential integrity of the pact. Hence, the title of the first part of the chapter, Amnesiac Interruptions, a Memory Divided Against Itself. The examination of this aspect of Said's autobiographical movement stems from a confusion triggered basically by Said's confession in the preface to Out of Place that this memoir is primarily a record of an essentially lost and forgotten word. And we find ourselves wondering here, how can an autobiographical subject claiming his own liability to factual inaccuracies keep to the promises of an autobiographical fact that foregrounds referentiality as its key, perhaps as its key, I did not find it.
Sorry, passing remark. You have already used up 20 minutes.
Really?
Yes, you are granted 5 more minutes just to conclude and run up.
Oh my goodness.
Or else, you make me
30%.
think that Professor Abinamon has good students. When he starts, he gets carried away.
Okay.
Can she borrow 5 minutes from our
Of course, because I welcome the audience, those are already 5 minutes. So the speech itself has taken 10 minutes already. Okay, how much time do you have?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Okay. Probably I'll skip some parts. Just in connection to memory here, I want to say that Said's conception of memory is metaphorical rather than a literally decoding apparatus that is a referential rendering of experiences. And as Samuel maintains in the Theatres of Memory, so far from being handed down in the timeless form of tradition, memory is progressively altered from one generation to another, and just like history, it is inherently revision and never more chameleon than when it appears to stay the same. I'll have to skip some parts, I think, and probably I'll have time to elaborate on them further discussion.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Just one more remark about this chapter is that the ambivalence of Said's autobiographical posture can be detected through an investigation of the discourse of trauma or traumatic historiography. And my focus on this very experience has been governed by the ambivalence and the mystery of this aspect of Said's text. The focus is led on Said's exilic experience because of its inherent unrepresentability and ambivalence. For Said, the first dislocation from a place that he took for granted and from which he drew his sense of belonging originates in the production of a psychic and spatial moment of unholiness that lies much of the heart of his ambivalent posture. And so this experience communicates to Said, I quote, the enigmas of being without a country or a place to return to, of being unprotected by any national authority or institutions, of no longer being able to make sense of the past except as bitter, helpless regret. So the provisionality of Said's homely space differs the closure of signification and also brings an interruption within the rationale of the Legenian fact. This part of the chapter examines also the way the fall of Palestine functions as a vantage point to the narrative, or what Alan Young calls the pathogenic secret that acts as the central organizing principle for a relationship to the past. Here, I skip this part. I'll move to the chapter, the second chapter very quickly and summarize it in perhaps one paragraph. I'm obliged because I don't have time.
No problem.
Okay. It is entitled The Anxiety of Reference, Diasporic Subjectivities, and the Referential Fallacy. The first section of this chapter sheds light on the ethnic split and the enunciative polyphony characteristic of out of place, which violates what Bruce, I'm not sure about the pronunciation of her name, Elizabeth Bruce or Bruce, which violates what Bruce called the illusionary act of autobiographical discourse in reference to the identity between author, narrator, and protagonist. And the following section is a continuation of the same argument. It is entitled Born to Die, the Deconstruction of the Subject-Object Paradox. And it investigates the way Said's enunciative polyphony dismantles the cluster of Neo-Sobomian features. And these features are violability exerted through the body, denial of subjectivity manifest in Said's discursive position, and instrumentality performed by photographic ritual. Because of the direct effect they seem to bear upon the fact. I'll skip these parts too, and I'll go directly to perhaps one aspect of this objectification feature, which is photography, for instance. Coming to this part, it is entitled The Return of the Spectre, the Photographic Ritual, and the Horror of Inauthenticity. It examines the way Said reappropriates his politics of objection in the deconstruction of the binary dialectic of photography. The manifest paradox confronting Said, the autobiographical subject, of course, within this act of textual composition, is his experience of his past self, signified past self, as at once the same and yet as other to it, strangely as other to it. And at the very moment when a souvenir comes back, at that very moment when a souvenir is born, the autobiographical subject undergoes a form of death. And this is, as Barth says, brings us to the similarity or the comparison that Barth strikes between the autobiographical act and the photographical ritual, which are both, according to Barth, symbolic of a premonition of death. Now, of course, when all the above crises intersect, the outcome is a break in the very generic composition of the text. And this is why I said that Out of Place is not a memoir, rather an entire memoir. Okay, I'll skip. I have so many explanations to go through, unfortunately. Yeah, I'll have to say 3 words about the third chapter, probably, and the findings before. Right. The third chapter is entitled, but you'll give me time from the discussion to be able to collaborate on this. Yeah. Promise?
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on very quickly to the last chapter, it is entitled The Politics of Nonfiction, the Discursive Redevelopment of Post-Colonial Space, and it is an inquiry into the nature of Said's politics of genre, specifically the way Said contaminates the ambivalence of his subject position to the colonial text by occupying a Wahhabian third space of enunciation. So the way Said deconstructs the Manichaean dialectics of binarism in favor of a more liminal appreciation of the hegemon subaltern encounter is important insofar as it foreshadows one of the key projected findings of my analysis, which is post-colonial self-fashioning is a phantasmic space in which both metropole and colony become impossible objects, or subjects, or objects, better. Impossible objects, situated between both. And Said's redevelopment of the colonial space coincides with his wish to interrupt the movement of such a hegemonic apparatus, to be somehow disembodied. Therefore, he develops a tacit fascination with the secret art of invisibility. What is particularly interesting here in Said's position is that the sensation the subaltern figure introduces in the metropolitan instance resembles something that reminds us of the cat-man encounter in the reader's The Cat That Therefore I Am. As soon as the man is gazed at naked, he is immediately forced to inquire, who am I, in the personal borders between man and animal. And once the subaltern instance comes into contact with a subaltern figure, he or she is confronted with his or her own nudity, ironically reflected through the eyes of another. And so the cat here, in the reader's terms, does not emerge as a mere mediator or identity. It itself has an unsubstitutable singularity. And hence the reader's declaration, he says, I quote, no, my cat, the cat that looks at me, does not appear here as a representative or ambassador. If I say it's a real cat that sees me naked, it is in order to mark its unsubstitutable singularity. I see it as this irreplaceable living being that one day enters my space, enters this place where it can see me, encounter me, see me even naked. Nothing ever take away from me the certainty that we have here is an existence that refuses to be conceptualized. And so sorry? No, I have just 3 or 4 findings. May I go through them very quickly? Thank you very much. Okay, this moment, the Saidian autobiographical moment, is a moment of apocalypse in a way that foreshadows a border crossing journey between the beginning and the end, and it at the same time signals the end of subjectivity, the end of perhaps the end of selfhood itself. And this, the importance of Said's third spatial positioning has obviously managed to escape the trap of essentializing and dehistoricizing the discourse, both the discourse of genre and the discourse of culture. And if there is also another thing which Said's Out of Place contributes to, it is the production of a lawless form of writing, where both genre and culture emerge as a textual, as a symbolic textuality, and within which there is always an interrupted division of the sign, which reminds us of Bhabha's notion of the time lag, which makes us move forward, ironically, by interrupting us, by blocking our movement towards, perhaps towards a synchronic history. And so what Said does is that he problematizes and reconceptualizes the border between culture and literature. And perhaps I round up with this. This takes me by the hand to one aspect of our academia life, which is the division between the discourse of culture and the discourse of literature, often maintained in that division between, and I mentioned this in the conclusion, of course, often maintained in the division between culture studies and literature studies. This is a time where we can no longer accept that division. And I said that at the end that my analysis itself, of course, I'm not supposed to include myself in the analysis, but I can't help it. The analysis itself is a subaltern instance, which takes me to another space, to a third Marbian third space of enunciation, if you want. And this is why I said it's a subaltern, the radiant evil eye, that never ceases to locate us and relocate us in third spaces, in what Lefebvre calls in his the first declaration, famous declaration, il y a toujours là. Thank you very much for your attention.
Time management as well.
Yes,
Because
yes.
you're going to be a teacher, and you are a teacher. When you have a lecture to deliver, it takes
My students here,
45 minutes. Not 1 hour and a half minutes. Sorry. Okay, thank you, Safa.
Thanks very much.
Insightful and very thrilling. I can see that you're really immersed in theory. Very quiet, like a sponge.
Thank you.
Oozing. The theory
No,
oozing
pleasure.
out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. And this is, yes, to your credit, of course. And certainly, the children's credit too.
Of course.
Thank you. Now, without further ado, I turn to Professor Benamor.
Thank you.
Who is going to evaluate your work and certainly will bring us some kind of a sense of proportion, perhaps. Or kind of,
You may let me your microphone.
sorry,
Does that work? Yeah.
there you are. The center cannot hold it.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the quality of your oral performance.
Thank you very much.
About giving a presentation. Even if I have a minor grievance because, well, you know, we want our students. Now you are our colleague.
No, I'll be forever
Confident.
student. I'll be forever student.
We want them to be confident, but not overconfident. We want them to be easygoing, but not self-indulgent. And you remind me of the first encounter between Claudius and his court and the assassination of Hamlet. So probably you were carried away by the tune of music, but I guess it is probably out of pressure. In theatre, there are different ways of breaking the fourth wall, actually, and maybe the kind of performance you are supposed to deliver today is different from the performance in a classroom or in a conference. But I mean, I deliver this remark in a very kind way, actually. But it's not only for yourself, but also for the audience present here.
No, I did not really grasp what you precisely meant by this.
Digressions, welcoming people coming into the audience room, swimming. So that is indeed to be taken into consideration.
Right.
Thank you again for the clarity of your presentation, which is very fluent, very articulate, very precise. And I definitely agree with Professor Khalifa when he said that time management is indeed an obligation. And certainly you are very enthusiastic about what you have done and what you have read. But the most difficult task is to know how to restrain oneself within the limit of space which is unfortunately also reflected in your substantial work, because this is an LMD dissertation, which is supposed to be a 60-page dissertation, and you delivered a 149-page dissertation. And even for an old Humanities dissertation, 150 pages is really too much. So, yes, you read and you have lots of things to say and lots of interesting ideas, but it makes part of the expertise is to know how to limit oneself within a particular space. It is much more difficult, indeed, to deliver a 60-page dissertation than a 150-page dissertation. So I hope that you will take that into consideration in your future researches, and certainly you will have plenty of time to expand with your ideas and your enthusiasm in future articles. And I do consider it as a defect is the length of your essay. You know why? Because first of all, it could serve as a bad example for future students. Secondly, because, well, you are able to write 149 pages, but there are some other students who won't be able to write properly 149 pages. Thirdly, because I do consider that as a kind of a self-indulgent behavior. It means that you did not manage to limit yourself to the restrictions imposed on you, which were imposed on purpose, actually. So, if, maybe later, if you try to justify the length of your essay, I mean, it is indeed in there because of the quantity of things you want to develop. If you can say something in that context to defend yourself, that would be all right. Now, just very few remarks as far as your introduction is concerned. It is rather long. And I think that instead of engaging a general debate related to post-colonial subjectivity, you should have concentrated on introducing your topic and probably defining, starting some of the key concepts. I think it would have been a bonus. Probably a display of the major problems raised in the introduction would have been enriching. We need to see the problem, which is to be raised. Well, you did explain yourself in a very clear way in this oral presentation. The beginning of your first chapter attempts to establish a display and an explanation of the autobiographical acts, which is very legitimate. However, I noticed an absence of any attempt to explain the concept of self-fashioning. The expression self-fashioning makes part of your title. You started mentioning self-fashioning from page 28 on, and this is my first question to you. How did you account of the use of the concept of self-fashioning in a thesis focusing actually on genres, on autobiography within a post-colonial context, knowing that self-fashioning is a concept that goes beyond post-colonialism.
Goes beyond?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
The concept of self-fashioning actually is a concept which is not to be framed within the paradigm of post-colonialism.
Do you think so?
I am asking you a question. Can you please answer, or you prefer to answer by the end?
Just this question or the other questions?
Yeah.
Shall I go through
It's
this?
up to you.
Okay. Right. Now, concerning the length, I said I found myself obliged because I needed to approach the text from two scopes, basically, the poetics and politics of genre. I could have just gave you 2 chapters and I'm done with it. Okay? But I said no. This has to do with my intention or my objectives. What I have in mind is that to approach the text from within a dialectical zone. I did not only want to do this and not to do that. So I said, I'll take the risk. I know it's a risk.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Okay.
far as the length, we cannot discuss this. I'm asking you one particular question about self-fashion.
Okay, I thought you asked me about the length. But you gave the remark.
No.
All
I
right.
asked you the question, how would you account
And the
of
key
the use of the concept of self-fashioning? This is my question. How would you account the use of the concept of self-fashioning?
Right.
You know, having to do with an autobiography within a post-colonialist context. That is my question.
Okay. And you said, how didn't I define self-fashioning? Actually, the whole analysis can be read as a way to capture the meaning of self-fashioning. And this perhaps stems from a personal conviction that I do not prefer the inductive method of defining key notions. I prefer rather the deductive method. As I said, this is because I want to give the reader a sense of what Barth calls the pleasure of the text. So I wanted to leave the notion open-ended, and you can take the whole analysis, as I said, as a way to capture the meaning of post-colonial self-fashioning itself. The relation that I made between self-fashioning and genre or autobiographical discourse is, of course, legitimate because we can no longer today
Who coined the concept self-fashion, please?
Sorry?
Who did?
As far as I know, it's Stephen Greenblatt. In his book, Shakespeare and the Renaissance Culture, or the question of culture in Shakespeare.
Yeah, so how would you account for the concept of self-fashioning within a post-colonialist concept?
Yes, of course, because it's even similar to Stephen Greenblatt's conception, because he said what Stephen Greenblatt basically did is that he opened the text to culture by coining the concept of the textuality of history and the historicity of text. And so here we can no longer maintain the disruption, as I said, between the discourse of culture, whether be it ethnic culture, post-colonial culture, colonial culture, any type of culture, we can no longer maintain that division between culture and genre, which is literature by the end of the day. That's my justification, basically.
Okay, that's fine. You know,
Thank you.
just a question. Okay, the second question I'm asking you, you worked on the idea of biography and autobiography, and I would like to ask you again to explain in brief words the major differences between a biography and an autobiography.
Okay. First, there is one basic difference, which biography is the history of a person written by somebody else, and autobiography is the history of a person written by that very person itself. But careful, because in the postmodern debate, the boundary has been collapsed, because even the autobiographer who is writing his own autobiography is considered as somebody else. Strangely different to the writing eye. There is a discrepancy between the subject of enunciation and that of utterance in the first person. And so, yes, there are differences, but in the postmodern debate, these differences are collapsed. Because even the autobiographical subject is considered to be as someone who is different from the one who actually wrote it. You see what I mean?
All right, yeah, that's fine, thank you. On page 18, you mentioned the expression identity. Second paragraph, the whole process should move towards an entirely opposite direction, where identity would grant resemblance. And you had a tendency to use the expression identity in many instances, but I would like you to give me an explanation justifying or explaining your understanding of identity.
Right.
So how would you identify, or how would you, let's say, define identity?
Okay. Now first I need to make clarification, and I'll be honest about that. If I had more time, I would perhaps omitted the word identity and replaced it with subjectivity. Because even if today we understand that identity is more of a process, generally it's taken, I'm saying generally, it's taken as a given. And so it's robbed from its inherent open-endedness. I would rather use for that the concept of subjectivity, formation, or deformation, as I call it. You're asking me about the meaning of that. Of course, it is generally it's the way one fashions the sense of him or herself in a particular space and time. Right?
Yeah, because as I told you, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm aware of that, yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah. On top of page 39, the first paragraph, we said, out of place evokes that the paradoxes of autobiographical agency, both in its prospects and inadequacies, in inhabiting a world where telling the truth is simultaneously within and beyond the reach of the autobiographical subjects. And this, indeed, and also for the sake of triggering off the debate, a certain question came to my mind, and I would like to share with you actually and see how you would perceive things. And my question is, how important is the act of retrospective narration in Out of Place? And in other words, what is the limit of the conscious and the unconscious in the act of narration in Out of Place? Can you answer
Your question is about the importance of the act of retrospective narration in Out of Place. Actually, as I said, the importance of this act of remembrance or reminiscence stems from its parodic force. That is, it makes Out of Place and its autobiographical project move towards a totally different and unexpected direction. Because what is particularly left from the past in Out of Place are only just traces of a life that refuses to be channeled through the very medium through which they might possibly see the light. And this is why I said I honestly found the investigation of this aspect of Said's experience very difficult, because Said blocks our attempts at finding a dialectic center or an anchorage point from which we can investigate the study by declaring already in the preface, I think in the second paragraph, that Out of Place is essentially the record of a lost and forgotten world. And I raised the question earlier, as I said, how can we in fact believe anymore in the legitimacy of our project if Said himself says that this is an inaccurate account?
Okay, so where is the space of the conscious in all that?
The space of, okay,
yeah.
Perhaps the space of, I can answer you, let's start by the space of the unconscious first, because, and then I'll come to, because they are related. Because one of the critics, Patty Miller, said the following: always the conscious mind, the unconscious mind has agendas which do not necessarily correlate to the conscious mind. And so Said, yes, puts this philosophy into practice by providing us with a concept of memory which Young calls it liminal spot, that is in whose spaces past and present selves melt. And this leads us also to Starobinsky's declaration that this concept of memory literally, because it's discursive, it's shaped textually, it literally burns autobiographical subjectivity, reducing it to mere ashes. And here I want to quote the French quotation, which I think answers your question, and I think it's also very important in Said's generic conception. John Starobinsky said, and I quote the French quotation because it sounded to me more expressive. À vouloir trop se rapprocher du foyer de son être, celui qui se cherche sur la voie des écritures intimes risquerait de se brûler à la flamme qu'il a allumée. Le langage humain ne supporte pas de trop violente surcharge énergétique. Il arrive qu'il fasse sauter les fusibles et mettre les feux au circuit du discours. Donc, what Said does is that il met le feu au circuit du discours, as Starobinsky says. But what is conscious? What is conscious here is what Said seems to be struggling here to confirm his sense of being Palestinian, of a Palestinian descent, which so many critics doubted, like Erwin. Erwin said, this is a dishonest account. This is the work of a malignant person, he said. And so I think that this is not much a proof of dishonesty on the part of Said as a struggle to perhaps answer those who doubted his Palestinian identity, his Palestinianhood, if we might say. this is where basically the conscious scope of Said's memory comes into view. And is that enough?
You know, that's all right. You know, just something which is limited actually. This idea of retrospective narration, the space of the conscious within the unconscious, has to do with giving an account about the traumatic experiences. Giving an account about traumatic experiences or qualifying them as traumatic experiences would lead me to this question, actually, this interrogation. I personally don't have a final answer to that. How traumatic are these experiences indeed in reality, in this act of narration, which is an act of retrospection? You see what I mean? So, my question had to do with that actually, because as I told you, you mentioned the traumatic experiences, and I wondered whether can we reconsider or consider them as traumatic experiences, or reconsider them.
So you're implicitly doubting the traumatic nature of this is what I understood. Probably, yeah?
It's not doubting, actually. It is relativizing.
Okay.
It is reconsidering.
And this is what Said does the same, actually, that he relativizes. And I said it. In this part, if you follow the rationale of my work, in this part I dealt with the Palestinian, the exilic experience, not as a negative or positive experience, not as a good for us experience, and I said we should also be able or careful not to trivialize or banalize its legacy. Yes, it has both pejorative and perhaps positive aspects, and this is why I focused on exilic experience, because it's ambivalent. Perhaps if the experience were of a negative or pejorative dimension, I wouldn't have taken the trouble to delve in it from the beginning, because it doesn't serve my objective, actually. And
you don't need to justify, that's all right. You know,
yeah.
Just for the
yes,
sake of
right.
Yeah, figuring out what to make.
So the question, just one more word about the question. We consider it traumatic and not traumatic, both and none at the same time. This is it. You're not convinced?
No, that's not it. That's not it. But I would like to move on, actually. On page 54, your attention please. On page 54, you see this is a reflex. Your attention please. You mentioned, you attempted to explain the crisis of recognition by giving the example of Said as a butler on page 54. And honestly, I found this explanation not very convincing. But probably, you know, in relation to this idea, could you develop more this idea of crisis of recognition and out of place?
Okay. The crisis of recognition in out of place actually comes, is redoubled. I said once, because Said's consciousness itself seems to be refusing to yield in so easily to a sense of selfhood. And so this embodies in a way the Sartrean, you corrected me once, Sartrean nothingness of being, which shows that consciousness has a negative, what Sartre calls negative consciousness, actually, which always ends up dismantling and disrupting our sense of who we are. The second aspect, and this is why it is redoubled, because Said is negated his sense of selfhood by others, and of course you might think that the incident is not very significant, and there are loads of incidents which I could use and replace that incident, but it sounded to me so how shall I say it? So provocative, so simple but so provocative. Once Said comes to embrace Muhammad, actually the butler, and Muhammad says, no, this is not Said, the one I know. This is not Said. And so Said said just one or two sentences. He said, how come that this man does not recognize me? And so Muhammad seems to cast doubt upon the very Palestinian identity of Said, because Muhammad for Said denoted whatever is Palestinian, whatever is Arab, and whatever is human after all. And so if Muhammad, the one who loved with Said, hangs out with Said, and ate with Said, comes to deny Said a sense of his Palestinianhood, then how come Said Said himself seems to be wondering, have any more a sense of selfhood. And there are, of course, plenty of examples which confirm this. But this is basically the significance that
You know, why you notice that I'm asking lots of questions about out of place, because I personally felt that you should have paid more attention to the book, with more examples from the book.
Yeah.
And I am going to continue asking you questions about the book, just as an attempt to complement.
Just one thing, you know, and honestly, I am not lying, there's no reason why I should. I thought that I overused the book. So what I did is that I took out chunks of the memoir.
You know, these questions actually have to do with them. And I'm asking you another question about the book, which is how important is the religious background of Edward Said in shaping his identity?
Right.
The religious background.
Actually, yes. I answered the question now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there is a debate here, because some people say that Said, of course, regarding his background, is a Christian. But Said, in our place, says that no religious faith seems to make sense for me. And this is why Said is often seen as a humanitarian or a humanitarianist. And this humanitarianism is often attacked because, according to some people, it turns its back to Said's background, to Said's Palestinian background. And so I think there are two phases. You're asking about out of place. There are two phases in out of place, where Said deals with his Christian background, where he was in Palestine. And so the thing which I appreciated in Said's conception of religion here, and the way it helps him fashion his sense of who he is, he said that there was no conflict between Muslims and Christians, no legitimate conflict, according to him. And so he said, I really didn't find much or many problems in coping with that background. But then Said, probably because he was diagnosed with leukemia, he comes and he says it. He said that my illness, in a way, compelled me to cast doubt on all certainties. When he was diagnosed with leukemia, though he didn't say that explicitly, Said seems to develop sort of a nihilistic attitude, that is of the Dostoevskian melancholia. And he seems to be casting doubt about all sorts of certainties in the world. And so the experience in our place takes sort of an absurd scope here. And this is why I said there are two phases. First, when he fashions his sense of selfhood around the Christian background of his family and his life in Palestine, and then another phase where he casts doubt about foreign religion.
Yeah, indeed. And as I told you, I mean, methodologically speaking, I chose to ask you questions about the book instead of giving you suggestions to see if you could. Okay, now just sometimes also the questions are just very, very straightforward without any intentions, like this, the present one. On top of page 60, you mentioned this is how the narrative violates what Russ terms as the illocutionary act of autobiographical discourse in her reference to the identity between author, narrator, and protagonist. And you mentioned that also in your oral presentation.
Yes.
And I would like you, in a very blatant way, to limit, how could you limit the spaces of the author, the narrator, and the protagonist in Out of Place?
How could I limit?
Yeah, the spaces of the author.
Could you please reformulate the question?
Yeah. How could you limit or define the spaces of the author, the narrator, and the protagonist in Out of Place?
Right. Thank you for the question, and it actually goes at the heart of my argument, and I answered it. The two chapters answer this question. Said obliterates the logic of the autobiographical fact, which says that we need to maintain an identity between these three. But what Said does is that by clinging to the politics of anonymity, he seems to cast doubt upon the very referentiality of the status of this identity. And so, how would I define the spaces of the author, narrator, and protagonist in an out of place? I would say that this space is parodic par excellence. That's it.
Okay. Here, a suggestion or maybe a comment as far as your second chapter is concerned. It has attempted to focus on the complex self of Said. You used, for example, expressions like distant, dispersed, and visual self on page 61, for example. In other instances, you mentioned the shattered identity of Said. And I guess that in this case, probably, and I would like to see your opinion about that, an insight into, you did talk about these blurred frontiers between genres and spaces and so on and so forth. And just to corroborate what you have said, I said in this case probably an insight into psychoanalysis could have been pertinent. The notion of the quest in relation to the notion of the crisis, whatever, the idea of the holographic representations, whatever they are, or even the mirror image. So, what about these ideas actually? Yes,
I'll confirm your observation further by saying that I made already reference to that first by comparing Said's memory to a Lacanian objectivity, which produces resonance precisely and ironically by turning resonance and satisfaction into mix. That is, by reproducing itself as desire. And second, I said that this process of self-fashioning in Said's of the place reminds us of the curse described in the Heart of Darkness, the horror, where self-identification emerges ironically when the self realizes that it is no longer the same as the past signified self. And so, yeah, here we could have perfectly well used Lacan's mirror stage, but I was afraid not to be eclectic. So
the idea here, and probably it has also with suggesting, I think that you could have added plenty of footnotes. You could have reduced probably. Okay, there is one concept that you did not mention, and I think that it is very legitimate to think about it. And I'm sorry if I'm greedy actually, because I know it is the interest that I paid to the work that was triggering off my curiosity. What about the concept of self-loathing in out of place?
Yeah,
which is in the heart,
definitely, especially.
Yeah. So the concept of self-loathing, do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, of course. It's very legitimate in the context about the place, especially in relation to science connection to his body. And this, as I said, results in what I call necessary autophobia, which is crucial to the moment of self-identification. And so Said's father manipulates his body posture manipulates his body posture in a way that Said initially refuses to accept, but later that space between himself and his father turns into a chaseable territory, which as soon as Said recognizes that this might serve as a good territory from which he can initiate his process of self-fashioning. So self-loathing in the context of the place can be read both as a negative experience, but also as a crucial moment necessary for self-identification.
Okay, I'm trying to be brief, sorry. Maybe very two simple questions. I'm not asking you to. How could you account of the polyphonic in out of place? The polyphonic.
Yeah. Yes, the polyphonic enunciation out of place.
Yeah.
Right. Simply because Said gives us the multiplicity of voices, and it seems that at times he is listening to other inner voices we encounter in Bakhtin's dialogic imagination, where the peasants speak from or are aware of themselves through their position within different discursive community. And so the enunciative polyphony, the enunt of place, comes from the clash of voices that Said uses there, and from a little bit overdose of daring, intellectual daring. Who dare agree and disagree with the judge at this level? At this level. Because this is an end. So I think that it is ambitious and really challenging on your part to have done that and have proceeded in that way. We come to the topic, and I think that the whole beauty of this dissertation is in its challenging scope. When you come and say, I've chosen this topic because it accommodates and challenges at the same time an idea, this means that as a reader at this level, as a critic at this level, you're taking two stands. Normally we have a category of critics who go along with one argument, and another category of critics who go against that argument. Combining both in one stand is wonderful. Like when you say, okay, I can show you to what extent that can accommodate itself in my analysis. And it's what we call loop criticism. That is, you take a piece of criticism, you take an argument here, and then you make it come back to criticize it. This is wonderful. In this dissertation, that kind of mastery of the material, where you take it in your hands and you can twist it in so many directions, is wonderful. When you say, for example, chapter 1 raises some questions and chapter 2 answers some of the radical questions, just one thing is left, and chapter 3 will underline the findings. Very logical. So it's as simple as that. I like very much that when you talk, for example, about referential status, we hear it and we think that it is light. Anyone would say referential status. But when you take that notion, when you take that concept, and then you use it in your analysis, you integrate it in the analysis, and it becomes part of the analysis. Even in the oral presentation today, you were very fluent, and then going back and forth between critics and theorists without ever producing the effect that, while you're imposing statements on your own arguments, that was very fluid and also very good. The matter of the flow of thoughts. The flow of thoughts in this dissertation, they just moved in the dissertation. You just moved from one substantial idea to another substantial idea with no big mistake in terms of composition. That is, the overflow of thoughts is very well adapted to the fluidity of the expression. And I add to the fluidity of the reception. I wasn't bored. Despite the length of the thing, I could have listened to your oral presentation, I think, at least for another 30 minutes, at least. Which means that at no point it was repetitive or repetitious. And from the time we say it adds things to the argument and to what you have tried to develop in this dissertation, I'll say that it is all to your credit. Thank you very much. I have one last point, because it is my duty to do this. Be careful.
You have to stop at the right moment. In writing to us, your writing to me is pure pleasure. Your writing to you shouldn't be pure pleasure. You should be, because I'm receiving the writing, but you're producing the writing. You are much more limited by norms than myself, because in receiving your work, I could receive it scientifically and to an extent also emotionally. I can say it's all relevant and I do enjoy it. You have to say it's all relevant and it is all, and then later on you enjoy it more. And you have to, you should pay attention to this in the doctoral dissertation later on. And I'm sure that also the doctoral dissertation will be of very good quality. And I don't want to spoil this with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I really pity those candidates who are going to file up behind you after you. Because I think they will stick to the norms. And you are a little bit ahead of many researchers, and this is really a pleasure, as Professor Sousse said, to read your memoir and to listen to you, and to maybe time for me. I won't be very long, it will take me just 10 minutes. I'm just concluding, but I would like to start on this particular occasion, like in those puritanical churches in the, in America, and they started the founding fathers and all those early settlers in America. They would sit in a church and make amens. So today, I would like to make amends without making you cry again. Because I remember I had some clash or some misunderstanding with Safa. She was one of my best students of a program. And most of the time students, prepare papers and they submit these papers to me for evaluation and for my feedback. And I read her paper, and when I came back the following week, I gave back all the papers to all the students except her. I said, I would like to have a word with you. So I thought it was sheer plagiarism. I was suspecting that she pasted and copied something somewhere on the net. So I told her that, and she really could not, she couldn't have it. She was in tears. And I really, today, it's a good opportunity for me to, to say my mea culpa. And I was really wrong. Because she made me realize that she was one of the best students. Thank you.